Hello, good afternoon. Let me get my presentation up. Rob took care of my introduction, so I don't have to. I'm here to tell you today about a project that began about 1.5 years ago as a partnership with the Student Support Services Division in Clark County School District. And these folks administer to students who have special education needs that are also attending alternative schools. So we got together and we were starting to have some conversations about how this was a new type of service that they were providing, and they were extending their services, and they weren't really sure who they were serving. They didn't know a whole lot about the demographics and the academic history of the alternative school population. They weren't sure if there were certain areas in the trajectory to alternative education that might show evidence of more vulnerability for students. And they were really concerned about the lack of student voice in what their experiences were like when they were placed in these alternative settings. So we decided to work together to begin to identify what student needs were, what the needs of the system were in facilitating student development, and trying to determine how to best target early intervention services. So thanks to funding from Lincy, we were able to develop a research project and partnership to move forward on some of these goals. Okay, so just to give you a background, because not all of you may be familiar with alternative education, but alternative education in Clark County is pretty much where kids go when they've been suspended or expelled from general education settings. So if they've gotten in trouble in some way and they need to be receiving of services that, so continuing their education even though they're not able to continue it at their school. So no surprise, these are often called consequence schools because they're where kids go when they get in trouble. And there's two general ideas. There's behavior schools, which are typically 9-week programs. So if kids have 9-week suspension or an 18-week expulsion, they would go to a continuation school. Alternative schools serve thousands of students every year. And in 2009-2010, the numbers were almost 6,000 students, and 30% of these received multiple referrals. So they're going back and forth. And to help illustrate a little bit more about these students, typically the alternative education process would go something like this. I'm starting school at a general education middle school or high school, because that's who alternative schools serve, and I get in trouble. I get suspended from my campus. I have to withdraw from that school. There's going to be a period of several days at least where my placement is being settled. I then enroll in the alternative school. I might spend 7 or 8 weeks there depending on how much time is left on my my suspension or expulsion. Then I'm going to be, if I do everything right and I'm not re-referred, I'm going to disenroll from my alternative school, then I'm going to re-enroll in a different general education setting typically. So if you're a child and you're trying to have some sort of continuation for things like curriculum or relationships, there's usually some gaps that are happening in education. And so we were very interested in trying to understand how this process is affecting students, particularly because alternative schools are often the last stop before students drop out. So some schools, alternative schools actually have dropout rates that exceed 50%, which is not an acceptable level. I think most people would agree to that. And the other issue that we ran into is, well, why focus on special education in all students in alternative education? And the reason that this project focused on special ed students is because these kids are typically the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. So students in alternative ed are predominantly male. They're predominantly minority students, typically African American males. And there's an overrepresentation of students with learning disabilities and other types of special education needs. And many students who receive special education services also face other challenges, such as coming from low-income families, where they may be moving around quite a bit throughout their educational history. So taken together, special education students may be at an increased risk for eventually ending up in alternative school placement. So there's some relevant literature, but not a whole lot. One of the other reasons that we decided to focus on this project was, and one of the reasons that SSSD and I began to talk about this, is because they didn't have anywhere to turn to find out more about this particular population. There's very little research available on alternative settings. And that which does exist focuses on what we call a deficit thinking paradigm. And this is a paradigm where student failures are blamed on things like demographics and other types of individual factors rather than systemic factors. So instead of looking at things like, well, what can the school do to help facilitate your education, to make sure that you don't end up in this placement? Instead of taking a more broad perspective, it tends to be, well, you did this wrong. This is your individual failing. And some of the empirical work that exists would suggest that alternative schools, while they might be good settings for children and that they provide increased attention, they tend to lack academic rigor. So students are being sent to a place for 9 or 18 weeks, and then they're being asked to rejoin the general education setting. They may become increasingly far behind academically, which, if you already have a need for special education, may just increase your risk of not being able to fulfill your graduation requirements. Okay. And then the other part of this is trying to get a sense of expanding our ideas about what student disaffection is. So student disaffection is really characterized by active withdrawal from the educational setting. So we've got behaviors like, I'm deliberately going to create a problem in the class. I'm going to talk back to the teacher. I'm going to throw something. I'm going to push somebody. And oftentimes that type of disaffected behavior is symptomatic of other underlying problems. So things like motivational deficits or a lack of academic competence. Well, it's a lot easier for me to get kicked out of class than it is to sit there and show everybody that I have absolutely no idea what's going on in the actual classroom. And that literature also suggests that transactions between the individual and the educational system contribute to disaffection. Okay, so over time, over a history of negative transactions between what I as a student bring to the table and what the system provides back to me, over time, if I have negative transactions around academic tasks, I may become increasingly disaffected, which may increase my risk of alternative education enrollment. Okay. And last but not least, one of the things that we were also interested in is the role that school transitions play. So in that scenario that I presented to you, you have students that are in one setting, they transition to a different setting, and then they go back to a different school. So imagine that you're the student, you're already struggling in school, you have no continuity in your relationships, which often helps or hurts your school adjustment. There may be difficulties in obtaining academic experiences. So for example, you might not have the same history class at one school that you're having at a different school. And these types of issues can really be problematic for students when they're trying to correct their behavior and get back on track for graduation. Okay. So that's what we would actually call an unscheduled transition. So it's a transition that is not something that is normative. Okay, so it's not a middle school to high school transition, which is something that everyone goes through together. So the research goals for this project were to identify data, use existing data sources, secondary data from Clark County School District, to identify patterns of academic life that might lead to enrollment in alternative settings, and also to conduct a series of interviews with students during the transition process. So while they're at alternative schools and then back when they are in a general education campus, to try to understand their experiences and their perceptions of what is beneficial for them. We also have partnership goals to help Student Support Services Division develop their better capacity for understanding students and target services. All right. So the research design for this project was a mixed method sequential explanatory design in which we intended to collect quantitative data first and use that to identify some students to conduct follow-up interviews with and investigate student experiences. I just want to preface this by saying there have been some issues with data collection with this project, but we'll get to that. All right, so the way that we selected, or the way that I selected the sample for the quantitative portion was actually to take an entire year's worth of data that was available from the school district. So Count Day is a day in September that becomes the official enrollment day of record. So I requested data for all students that had enrolled and actually been in attendance at some point as of Count Day 2009 and 2010. That became the initial source of the population. So this included students, well, I requested data for students from 6th through 12th grade. Okay? So any students that could have potentially been enrolled in alternative placement at some point. From there, I also requested enrollment history in order to determine if they actually had enrolled in alternative settings and how often. Annual discipline counts, attendance data, and then standardized test data. The intention with this kind of data was to actually create, to knit together these different grade level cohorts. So we had 6th grade cohort, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. And using this data, we can go back and say, okay, can we see patterns in elementary school? Can we see patterns in middle school and high school that might lead us to some sort of information about why some kids end up enrolling in alternative settings and why some kids don't? So this is the actual data that I received. We have standardized testing data from 03 through 08, 09. There's some data I'm actually still awaiting receipt of from Clark County School District, including the 6th and 7th grade data. So I actually have data from 8th through 12th graders. And then there's a couple little gaps. So for example, we don't have this data for annual discipline counts. So that's why what you're going to see today are preliminary findings. They're just a general indication of information that I'm going to follow up on in further analyses once the data is complete. Okay. But my final population of students ended up being all 8th through 12th graders who had a learning disability or other health impairment, which is typically ADHD, but it's primarily learning disability categories, who had enrolled and showed evidence of attendance as of Count Day of 2009 and had available enrollment history data. So there had to be some sort of enrollment history. And so we ended up with over 1,000 students in the alternative education group and nearly 7,000 in the non-alternative group. And this is the entire population that meets this criteria. Okay? So you can see some differences. Typically, we have almost 84% of students are male in the alternative group. There are clear differences in ethnicity. So the alternative group is primarily, highest percentage is African American, as opposed to the non-alternative group, which is more typical of district-wide demographics. And there's some differences in placement. So the percent of time that kids in alternative schools are designated, that they receive special designations as to how much time they're supposed to spend in special education versus general education classrooms. And students in the non-alternative group are designated as spending a higher percentage of their time in general education classrooms. Okay. So this just actually does mirror what the district reports about the overrepresentation of African American males in alternative ed. Okay, so just to give you a descriptive sense of these groups, there are approximately 62% of students in the alternative group had enrolled at least once. So keep in mind that this includes 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. So this might be a 12th grader who enrolled just once. We could have an 8th grader who had enrolled once in 6th grade. We don't know the complete educational history yet for that 8th grader. Okay. And then another thing that I looked at is how many students changed schools within the academic year. So within year academic mobility, so kids that have a pattern during elementary school of frequently changing schools might have an increased risk of having behavior problems later. And it turns out that even though this isn't a statistical comparison, the mean level is definitely higher. So the alternative group had on average 1.17 transitions at some point during all elementary school, so within your school transitions, as opposed to 0.63 is the mean level for the non-alternative group. So that's something I definitely want to look into and follow up. Does changing schools frequently during elementary school lead potentially to patterns of behavior or expectations of relationships or adjustment issues that might lead to behavior problems? Is this a risk factor that early intervention might want to target? Okay, so then if we look at the academic performance history, the way this is presented is actually students that are not proficient, that do not meet proficiency standards for adequate yearly progress. So the emergent group is the lowest quartile, I guess, of the standardized testing. So these are students that are not doing very well on standardized tests. The approaches group are those who are approaching proficiency. And what I want to draw your attention to really is how in third grade, the alternative and the non-alternative groups are actually a little bit more similar with the number of kids or the percentage of kids in the emergent category and the approaches categories. But by the time kids get to 8th grade, it looks like students in the non-alternative group actually are, a higher percentage of them are moving into the approaches category, whereas with the students who end up going into alternative schools, they have a higher percentage that are moving into are staying in the emergent category. So they're not moving towards proficiency, they're staying back at a very low level, at least from standardized testing. The attendance records are based on are presented by grade level. And this is because of variations that we have with respect to missing data due to cohort differences, as well as missing data due to records from the school district. But again, just descriptively, we see a pattern of absences that are a little bit different for the two groups. So for example, students have, in the alternative group, have a much higher rate of excused absences, interestingly enough. I would have thought they would have been unexcused, but excused absences than their non-alternative group, than their non-alternative peers. So this is, again, a fairly consistent pattern. You see 15.21 days on average annually, so on and so forth. So yet another piece of data that would suggest that perhaps there are issues with academic adjustment that we're not just seeing only from alternative school placement. And then I just wanted to give you a snapshot of a couple of the discipline pieces of information that I've collected. So the discipline data, the way that I organized it is looking for 9th grade students, if we have data for them for 06, 07, 07, 08, and 09, 010, that would be their discipline data if they were in grade 6, grade 7, and grade 9, okay? So what that does is it gives us some sense of what their discipline levels were like, and this is their conference referrals, so parent conferences, suspensions, and expulsions. And you can see that the alternative school students, no surprise, they end up in alternative school because they're having behavior problems. But again, consistently in 6th grade and 7th grade, they're having higher levels in particular than their non-alternative peers. And we're seeing the same thing here. I have to say that consistently across the different grade cohorts, 8th through 12th, middle school seemed to be, for those students that I had discipline data for in middle school, that really seemed to be a period where the referral rate and suspension rate in particular was much higher than when they dropped down and got into high school. And when we turn to some of the qualitative data I'm going to show you, I think there's some indications of why that might be. Okay, so quantitative summary. taken together, none of this should be a big surprise, okay? We have kids that have behavior problems. What I think is interesting is that even looking back to early ages, we begin to see potentially some indicators that, taken together, it would suggest that we might be able to develop something of a typology that would allow us to better target early intervention services for kids receiving special education services in elementary school. Okay, so if you have frequent mobility, if there's attendance issues, if you're struggling academically, taken together, perhaps if we're able to intervene more effectively earlier, then they might not get to a point where behavior is creating a problem when they transition to middle school, which seems to be a time of potentially increased risk for them. Okay. And so I'm waiting on additional data so that I can do some more in-depth analyses of student trajectories, test some effect size statistics, and look at statistical differences, and look at predictors of risk. Okay. So moving on to some of the qualitative methods, this is the fun part. I started to do some interviews with students, 2 from each grade level was the goal, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. The participants had to have a learning disability, they had to be enrolled in behavior continuation school for the initial interview, and they had to have recidivated. Okay, so they had to have had an earlier experience with alternative ed in addition to their current experience. And the reason that I wanted this was to be able to ask them, you've been here before, what was this like for you? How did you transition back? And so on and so forth. And so as to date, we're actually still conducting interviews. I've received a second small grant to continue this into May of next year. But we have 11 student participants who were enrolled in one of 4 alternative schools. We had 2 behavior schools and 2 continuation schools on board. No surprise, 10 of them were males. And we're fairly evenly distributed across grades at this point. Not really expecting any 6th graders. We just don't get a lot of kids that end up in alternative placement. Still trying to get some 7th graders, and we're going from there. Okay. So the interview protocol was loosely based on a life history approach, and the intent was to conduct these 2 in-depth interviews. They're very open-ended, conversational style. The first interview is during that initial alternative school placement, and the second is scheduled for when they're transitioning back to comprehensive campuses. We've conducted 1 second interview to date, and we have a couple more scheduled. There's some logistical issues in getting facility letters and permissions from different schools. That just extends the time a little bit. And the interviews have lasted anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour. So the first interview really is asking students about their general experiences since their first enrollment in CCSD. So what we're trying to understand is, what are their support systems like in school? What do they feel like as far as their competence level is? To what do they attribute their reasons for engaging in the behavior that's led them into trouble? And then the second interview is actually, to me, the more interesting interview. And so far, the one that we've actually conducted would indicate that that is the case, where we're asking them to reflect on the meaning that they attribute to their current experiences, their current transition. And I've got some interesting things to say about that. Okay, so from initial coding, this will probably change as we get more data in, but I wanted to share some information with you. We have 5 general themes or domains that have kind of emerged. Students tend to talk a lot about their social relationships, that with staff as well as peers, and the importance that that plays in their experiences. They talk about their personal attributes, so things like their individual interests or their individual beliefs, sense of themselves. They've also actually discussed some of their problem-solving activities. What do they do in order to meet challenges in their environments? And then they've talked a lot about processing. So how do they process the actual environment that they're in? When they're in the alternative setting, what does that mean to them? Versus processing of particular events. So things like divorce or some sort of external event. Okay. So personal attributes. This is students tending to discussion again. Beliefs, perceptions, reasons for engaging, disengaging in school. And this really tended to emerge from discussions of factors about those things that facilitate or inhibit their school adjustment. And some of the things that they discussed in particular were interest in activities and peers as the reason for coming to school. Now this is interesting. This is why they get there. This isn't necessarily why they behave a certain way or what they think about school, but this is why they say they walk in the door. Some children in particular, it seems like extracurriculars like football were huge for them. I come because of football. That's why I'm here. Or I come to talk to my friends. Sometimes students help the peers actually get them into more trouble, no surprise. Sometimes it's a helpful thing. The other thing that really came out from their discussion of personal attributes were sort of these enduring emotional orientations towards school. So things like anger or boredom, and these were a common source of problems. So for example, this interviewer asked, you said that you threw scissors at a teacher, what made you do that? The student said, well, like my anger and stuff. Like when I get angry and I get used, like when I get angry and I used to get angry and there was no stopping me, like anything you told me not to do, I would do. So this student's saying, hey, it's my anger, I've got anger issues. Some students actually that talked about these issues were able to get some help from different social services. Other students say that they really haven't been able to resolve some of these issues. Other things that they talked about were beliefs about their self and behavior that also leads to academic conflicts. So this student in particular was saying, hey, I'm a good student, but at the same time, I also view myself as somebody you're not going to mess with. Okay, so if you disrespect me, I'm going to react in this way. So that creates a conflict for academic environments. And this is interesting because this is actually a somewhat common theme. So I view myself as I believe that school's important, and I believe that I'm not a bad student, but at the same time, I have these views of myself that are in conflict with what I know I'm supposed to be doing at school. Social relationships were also a big issue. So peers were both a source of engagement as well as a source of problems. So we had some disparate views about peers. Students were very insightful about their roles of peers. So many of them would say, you know what? The reason I did better when I transitioned to a new school was because I didn't know anybody. There was nobody there to get me into trouble. Whereas other students were saying, well, yeah, but the reason I come to school is because I really like my friends. My friends are very helpful for me. And then school staff interactions featured heavily in discussions. And this was something of a surprise. So some students felt that the alternative school teachers, classroom teachers, were more attentive and spent more time with them. Based on the small amount of existing literature on this topic, I thought that we would see more of this than we did. But for the most part, non-classroom teachers were actually mentioned more frequently as sources of support. So people like coaches or counselors or even special education facilitators. Unfortunately, oftentimes the classroom teachers were more of a source of conflict as perceived by the students than a source of assistance. So for instance, this child was talking about interactions with teachers and how this influenced their behavior. And he's pretty much saying, if teachers get mad, or if they won't listen to me, or if they won't help me, then I'm not going to talk to them. I'm not even going to try anymore. Okay? So this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity for teachers to be available for students, to help them, even if the students might be exhibiting some disaffected behaviors or not participating overly much. There's ramifications for the actions, for the interpersonal relationships and the actions that occur in classrooms. Students also talked about how they approach problems. So there was probably no big surprise given the educational experiences of these students. But there was a really big difference in students' willingness to use problem-solving strategies in the classroom and their knowledge of strategies. So in general, there were very low levels of knowledge about how to access help. Okay? And the strategies that they used were typically things like, I would ask a friend, or I might ask a teacher. We didn't see a lot of more sophisticated types of problem-solving strategies for classroom ends, or for classroom help. But on the positive side, we do see that students were willing to go to teachers and classmates and peers. They weren't completely withdrawn in academics. Environmental processing. This was interesting, I think, for our partners in CCSD to hear students say, hey, look, the actual concept of alternative schools for me is frightening, not because I know that I did something wrong and I have to go there, but because I know that it's going to put me further behind. That when I go there, there's problems, there's going to be kids. Teachers don't have time to teach. We heard this consistently. Teachers can't teach here because they're dealing with other problems. I get worksheets. This is what happens. So when I'm processing the implications of this environment, it's not necessarily, hey, this is a ramification for my behavior. It also is, how is this going to affect me? I know I'm going to get further behind, and this is a very stressful process for me. So on the other hand, though, students also were helpful in recognizing that changes in the environment and school culture were helpful in forming new relationships and their academic adjustment. So sometimes that removal is a positive thing as well. So maybe we just need to find a way to balance that. So this teacher was saying, or this student was really kind of interesting. He was talking about elementary school and how he transitioned and saying, you know, I went to this new corny school. And, you know, it was great. Everybody, yeah, you know, everybody was on me all the time, and it wasn't as ghetto. And what it came down to is he was actually talking about the school culture, how the school culture was more consistent as far as asking kids to be involved and maintaining structure. And again, that is something we consistently saw. Students might say, I didn't like that teacher, but they stayed on me. So my new situation had a culture that required me to participate, as opposed to allowing me to fall by the wayside. And then finally, event processing. I'm gonna be quick, I promise. Okay, so this is students reflecting on important life events. So that, and their experiences of behavioral and psychological adaptation. So one of the things that we found really interesting, and I was not expecting, is that students really seem to have this shift in beliefs about the importance of school when they got to high school. So suddenly their lack of involvement or lack of learning, their inability to remain engaged in elementary and middle school for whatever reason, suddenly that mattered. Okay, they get to high school and all of a sudden it's like, hey, you have to pay attention. And so despite the fact that a lot of these kids had consistent behavioral problems, many of them began to see the importance of school and wanted to go to college, but at the same time, many of them also expressed concerns because they knew that they were far behind. Okay. And then another consistent pattern that we saw was that when students, many of these students had transitioned frequently during elementary school, gone to different schools. And the expectation when we began to read these interviews was really that they, and began to do these interviews, was that they might, you know, the literature on resiliency and the importance of relationships would be, oh, if only I had somebody, that type of thing. I'm missing this. And there wasn't that sense from them. The sense was almost like, well, this is just the way it is. It's the status quo. And instead it seemed as if many students actually had revised their expectations for the school system downwards. So it's not, oh, people were mean to me, or oh, I couldn't get the help I needed. It's like, well, this is just the way it is. You know, I wasn't expecting anything different. And so we also saw students begin to form beliefs or change their beliefs about why others responded to them in certain ways based on their experiences. So many students had discussed that they felt people treated them differently once they knew that they had been at alternative schools. Okay, so this is we've got pages and pages and pages of wonderful interview data from these students that we're looking forward to spending quite a bit more time with. But at present, some of the consistencies that we see with the qualitative data is that school supports and student resources, they interact to influence student adjustment in school. So students might not have sufficient knowledge problem-solving strategies to succeed and might not necessarily view the system as open for assistance. But at the same time, students recognize that they're bringing something to the table that might not be conducive for adapting well either. And that we also see a history of negative or just sort of null experiences, students being ignored or students not participating fully, as contributing to a downward revision of expectations to themselves and others. Okay. So as we move forward, there's some things I'd like to consider, for instance, curricular coherence. So are students able to keep up? Do they recognize gaps in their education when they're transitioning? Some of the distinctions and similarities between school climate and how that facilitates student adjustment. And then really focusing as well on understanding the impact that these transitions have on students' motivation, engagement, and academic learning. Okay. So we're continuing to collect data, and we're going to develop a series of narratives about individuals as well as across different settings. Okay. So the preliminary results from the mixed method study I think are intriguing and ripe for follow-up. And what it suggests to me is that early school experiences do have influence on subsequent behavior. And we might be able to be more effective in our intervention if we're able to identify what those are. That middle school definitely appears to be a time of increased vulnerability for students, and especially those who are already suffering or who are already open to problems. And this is consistent with the middle school transition literature, but what it does offer, I think, is a slightly different perspective, in that it's not just 6th grade, that we're seeing challenges as well in 7th and 8th grade. And that student mobility might be an important indicator for early intervention. This came up both quantitatively as well as in the interview data. Okay. So partnerships, almost out of time. So we have ongoing meetings, myself and my team, as well as Student Support Services Division, to try to find ways to use this data to better target students and to identify more appropriate levels of need. So if you've got 2 facilitators that are serving multiple schools and thousands of kids, they need ways to determine how to best serve these students more efficiently. And the Student Services Division, they've actually found this partnership to be very helpful, and we're continuing to work together to develop the partnership, to talk about consistencies, and think about ways that I can offer technical expertise that they don't necessarily have access to. So things like training behavior mentors to consistently collect data and the importance of consistent data collection and the use of behavior plans. We're doing some no-cost evaluations of new programs that are provided by Student Support Services Division to alternative schools. And we're going to continue our research activities to try to learn more about this population to hopefully prevent kids from getting to alternative schools, and once they get them, they're to keep them in school. Okay. So we have other funding, yay, that's great. And thank you to Lincy. And then I'd like to acknowledge my wonderful student assistants, Kiana, Christy, and Kyle, as well as the Lincy Institute staff and my colleagues over at CCSD. Okay. Thank you.